Welcome to Ryan Epic Explains, where power, strategy, and history are examined without illusion. In 1915, a British diplomat named Sir Henry McMahon sat in Cairo writing letters to Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The letters contained a promise. If Hussein launched an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, Britain would support the creation of an independent Arab kingdom across the Middle East. Hussein agreed. He mobilized 30,000 fighters, sent his sons into battle, and tied down Ottoman divisions along the Hejaz Railway. Arabs bled for the Allied cause. They fulfilled their side of the bargain. But even as McMahon's ink was drying in Cairo, two other men were sitting in a London office drawing lines on a map that would make every word of that promise meaningless. Sir Mark Sykes, representing Britain, and François-Georges Picot, representing France, divided the Ottoman Arab territories between their two empires in a secret treaty signed on May 16, 1916. The Arabs had been promised a kingdom. They were being given a cage. And then, as if two contradictory commitments were not enough, on November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a 67-word letter promising the same contested land, Palestine, as a national home for the Jewish people. Three promises, three incompatible obligations, one region. This was not confusion, it was calculation, and the consequences would define the next century. The question that should concern us is not simply what Britain did. The historical record is fairly clear on that. The deeper question is this: why did Britain construct a system of contradictory commitments it knew could never be simultaneously honored? And what does the logic behind that system reveal about how imperial power actually operates when it must manage multiple strategic pressures at once? The answer, as it unfolds, suggests something unsettling. Britain did not stumble into contradiction. It selected contradiction as a tool. Each promise served a precise wartime function at the exact moment it was made, and the problem of reconciling them was deliberately deferred to a future that London assumed it would control. This was not poor planning. It was a specific form of imperial resource allocation, spending credibility in the present, borrowing against a future where the power to dictate terms would, presumably, still reside in British hands. The entire architecture of the modern Middle East was built on this gamble, and the gamble failed. To understand why Britain needed the Arabs at all, one must begin with the strategic position of the Ottoman Empire in 1914. When Constantinople entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in November of that year, Britain faced an immediate problem. The Ottomans controlled Mesopotamia, the gateway to Persia and its oil fields, which the Royal Navy had begun converting to as its primary fuel source only 3 years earlier. They controlled Palestine, which sat uncomfortably close to the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India, and they controlled the Hejaz, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, from which the Sultan Caliph could theoretically call a jihad against British rule across the Muslim populations of Egypt, India, and Malaya. Britain's problem was not merely military, it was structural. It needed to neutralize Ottoman influence among the Arab population. And the fastest way to do that was to offer the Arabs something they desperately wanted: self-determination. The Hussein-McMahon correspondence, exchanged between July 1915 and March 1916 in 10 carefully worded letters, was not an act of generosity. It was leverage. Based McMahon's language was deliberately vague on the precise boundaries of the proposed Arab kingdom, particularly along the coastal regions of Syria and the area of Palestine. This ambiguity was not accidental. It was the operating mechanism. Britain needed Arab military cooperation immediately. It did not need to define borders for years. The gap between the two timelines was where the strategic advantage resided. While McMahon wrote to Hussein, Britain's war cabinet was conducting a parallel calculation with entirely different variables. France, Britain's essential ally on the Western Front, had its own claims on the Ottoman territories. France had deep historical, commercial, and religious ties to Syria and Lebanon, dating back centuries. Losing French cooperation in Europe over a dispute about post-war Ottoman spoils was a cost London could not afford. This is where the Sykes-Picot negotiation becomes legible, not as a betrayal of the Arabs per se, but as a balancing act between two simultaneous strategic necessities. Britain needed Arab fighters in the field and French divisions on the Somme. The solution was to promise both parties what they wanted, privately, in separate agreements, and defer the contradiction. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed on May 16, 1916, divided the Arab territories with a line running roughly from Acre on the Mediterranean coast to Kirkuk in northern Mesopotamia. Everything north of the line, Syria and Lebanon, would fall under French control or influence. Everything south, Mesopotamia, Jordan, and the ports of Haifa and Acre, would fall under British control. Palestine, due to its religious significance, was designated for some form of international administration. Russia, the third party to the agreement, was promised Constantinople and the Turkish Straits. The agreement was classified. The Arabs were told nothing. The contradiction between McMahon's promises and Sykes-Picot was total, but it would not become visible for another 18 months. The third layer of commitment came in November 1917, and it introduced yet another set of claimants to the same territory. The Balfour Declaration was contained in a single letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. It stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The strategic logic was again precise. By late 1917, the war was not going well. Russia was collapsing into revolution, removing a major ally. The United States had entered the war in April, but had not yet deployed significant forces. Britain's War Cabinet believed, with varying degrees of accuracy, that a public commitment to Zionism would generate favorable political support in both the United States and Russia, where Jewish communities held perceived influence. The Balfour Declaration was not idealism. It was political arithmetic applied to a desperate moment. Its 67 words said nothing about boundaries, governance structures, or the rights of the Arab majority that comprised over 90% of Palestine's population at the time. The ambiguity, once again, was the mechanism. The concealment held until November 23, 1917, when the Bolsheviks, having seized power in Russia, discovered the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Tsarist Foreign Ministry archives and published it in Pravda, then in Izvestia. The reaction across the Arab world was exactly what one would expect. Sharif Hussein demanded an explanation from London. Britain responded with reassurances that the published text was merely a preliminary discussion document, not a binding agreement. This was not true, but the war was still being fought, and Hussein's options for alternative alliances were effectively non-existent. He continued the revolt. The structural dependency that had made the original promise necessary also made the betrayal survivable. For Britain, the Arabs had no leverage to enforce the commitment. They had only Britain's word, and Britain's word had been spent 3 times over on 3 different recipients. By October 1918, the war was ending. Faisal, Hussein's son, led Arab forces into Damascus on October 1st, believing he was claiming the capital of the promised Arab kingdom. The moment was electric, brief, and illusory. Within months, the Allied powers convened to formalize the post-war order, and the promises made during the war would be tested against the priorities of the peace. At the San Remo Conference in April 1920, the victorious Allies distributed League of Nations mandates over the former Ottoman territories. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain received the mandate for Mesopotamia and Palestine, including Transjordan. The mandate system was formally described as temporary stewardship to prepare indigenous populations for self-governance. In practice, it was colonial administration with international legal cover. The word mandate replaced the word colony, but the power structures were identical. Taxation, military control, border enforcement, and resource extraction all remained in European hands. What followed was not peace, but a sequential series of confrontations between the populations who had been promised freedom and the powers who had taken control. The first major rupture came in Syria. On March 8, 1920, the Syrian National Congress had proclaimed Faisal king of an independent Arab kingdom of Syria. France rejected this entirely. On July 24, 1920, at the Battle of Maysalun, a small and poorly equipped Syrian force under War Minister Yusuf al-Azma was destroyed by the French military. Al-Azma was killed. French forces entered Damascus the following day. Faisal was expelled from the country he had been promised. The Arab kingdom of Syria lasted 4 months. Britain's response to Faisal's expulsion was instructive. Rather than confront France, which would have cost diplomatic capital London needed elsewhere, Britain redirected Faisal. In 1921, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill arranged the Cairo Conference, which installed Faisal as king of Iraq and his brother Abdullah as emir of Transjordan. Neither population had chosen these rulers. The Hashemite family was given thrones as compensation for a kingdom they had been denied. The logic was not justice. It was efficient management of a strategic obligation that had outlived its usefulness. Iraq proved the most immediate demonstration of how artificial state construction generates its own resistance. 3 Ottoman provinces, Mosul in the Kurdish north, Baghdad in the Sunni center, and Basra in the Shia south, had been fused into a single state with no shared national identity, no common political tradition, and no agreed-upon governance structure. In the summer of 1920, before Faisal's installation, a massive revolt erupted across Iraq. Tribal leaders, Shia clerics, and Sunni nationalists briefly united against British occupation. Britain deployed over 100,000 troops and, crucially, the Royal Air Force. The RAF conducted aerial bombardment of Iraqi villages, a tactic that was cheaper than maintaining ground forces and that would become the template for British colonial control across the region for the next decade. Between 6,000 and 10,000 Iraqis were killed. Britain spent £40 million suppressing the revolt, more than the total cost of its wartime operations in the region. The cost-benefit calculation that had made Mesopotamia attractive was being inverted. Controlling Iraq was becoming more expensive than the oil it was meant to secure. This structural pressure, more than any moral reconsideration, drove Britain toward the mandate's eventual end. In Palestine, the contradictions embedded in the Balfour Declaration manifested with particular intensity. During the 1920s and 1930s, Jewish immigration accelerated, driven first by Zionist idealism and then, with devastating urgency, by the rise of Nazism in Europe. The Arab majority watched its demographic position erode and its political demands go unmet. The Palestinian Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was the largest and most sustained uprising in the mandate's history. Over 5,000 Arabs were killed, along with 400 Jews and 200 British personnel. Britain suppressed the revolt with considerable force, including collective punishment, house demolitions, and detention without trial. By the end of the revolt, Britain had effectively disarmed the Palestinian Arab population, a fact that would have decisive consequences in 1948. By the time the Second World War ended, Britain's capacity to maintain its Middle Eastern mandates had been structurally undermined. The war had drained the treasury, eroded military manpower, and accelerated nationalist movements from India to Egypt. In Palestine, both Jewish and Arab communities had concluded that Britain could not deliver what either side wanted. Jewish paramilitary organizations, including the Irgun and Lehi, launched an insurgency against British forces. Arab leaders demanded independence and an end to Jewish immigration. Britain, exhausted and unable to reconcile the irreconcilable, referred the matter to the newly formed United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states with an international zone around Jerusalem. The Arab states rejected the plan. The Jewish leadership accepted it. On May 14, 1948, Britain lowered its flag over Palestine. The last High Commissioner sailed from Haifa, and David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded. The first Arab-Israeli war had begun. Approximately 6,000 Israelis and 10,000 to 15,000 Arab combatants were killed. Over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in what became known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. The war ended with armistice lines that bore no resemblance to any of the borders Britain had drawn, promised, or imagined. The mandate was over. The consequences were permanent. What remained after Britain's withdrawal was not a resolution, but a set of structural conditions that made perpetual instability almost inevitable. Iraq carried its tripartite sectarian fracture, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, into every subsequent decade through monarchical rule, military coups, Ba'athist dictatorship, American invasion, and civil war. Syria's French-designed borders enclosed communities, Alawites, Druze, Sunnis, Kurds, Christians, whose coexistence required either genuine federalism or authoritarian control. It got the latter. Lebanon's confessional system, a French creation that allocated political power by religious sect, produced a state so fragile that it experienced civil war from 1975 to 1990 and has never fully stabilized since. Jordan survived only because the Hashemite monarchy proved more adaptive than the British had any right to expect, and Palestine remained precisely what Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration had made it: a territory defined by competing, irreconcilable claims, each rooted in a promise that was meant to serve a wartime interest and was never designed to produce a durable peace. The pattern across all of these outcomes is consistent. Britain did not fail because it lacked intelligence, foresight, or strategic sophistication. It failed because the structure of its wartime position required it to make commitments that could not coexist. The McMahon Promise served one front. The Sykes-Picot Agreement served another. The Balfour Declaration served a third. Each was rational in isolation. Together, they created a system of obligations that could only be managed as long as Britain retained the power to arbitrate between them. The moment that power receded, through financial exhaustion, military overextension, and the rise of American and Soviet influence, the contradictions became self-executing. Every conflict, every border dispute, every sectarian fracture in the modern Middle East can be traced, with varying degrees of directness, back to the period between 1915 and 1920, when the region's future was decided in rooms that none of its inhabitants were permitted to enter. When ISIS fighters bulldozed the sand berm between Iraq and Syria in June 2014, they filmed themselves, declaring the end of Sykes-Picot. The footage was broadcast worldwide. Whether or not the Islamic State understood the full historical weight of what it was invoking is debatable, but the symbolism was precise. A century after two European diplomats drew a line on a map, the people living on either side of that line still understood it as an act of foreign imposition rather than a reflection of any organic political reality. The line had been enforced by mandates, maintained by dictators, and defended by foreign armies. It had never been accepted. The lesson here is not that imperialism is immoral, though one may draw that conclusion independently. The lesson is structural. When strategic decisions are made to serve immediate pressures, military alliances, wartime logistics, resource access, and the long-term consequences are deliberately deferred, the debt does not disappear. It compounds. Britain's triple promise was efficient in the short term. It secured Arab fighters, French cooperation, and Zionist political support, precisely when each was needed. But it created a region whose borders reflected no ethnic, religious, tribal, or geographic logic, whose populations had been promised self-determination and received colonial administration, and whose foundational political trauma was the discovery that the promises made to them had been simultaneously made to others. The Middle East does not keep exploding, despite the decisions made in London and Paris between 1915 and 1920. It keeps exploding because of them. Power is finite. Credibility once spent is not easily restored. And when the architecture of an entire region is built on commitments that were never meant to be honored simultaneously, the structure does not hold. It fractures along exactly the lines where the contradictions were embedded. History does not forget where those lines were drawn, even when the people who drew them have long since left the room.